Hello and welcome. In this episode, Ukrainian fears of a big Russian trap in Kherson, and Lukashenko seems to be able to keep the Belarusian armed forces outside of the war, at least for now. Putin and Lukashenko were not talking about the war in Ukraine when they in the public part of their meeting, which happened a few days ago. Both emphasized, though, that Belarus is being threatened at its western border, meaning from NATO. This is an indication that Lukashenko has likely succeeded in not allowing Putin to push him towards an active involvement in the war in Ukraine. Putin also mentioned that he's considering whether Belarusian pilots should be trained in special weapons, which means nuclear weapons, because of the escalating security situation. All of this is basically maintaining the scenario according to which Belarus is being threatened from the west and thus can't reorient its armed forces towards the south. All of this shows is another indication that Belarus will not intervene in the war on Russia's behalf, at least for the foreseeable future. There's also been another big attack with Shahid drones on Kiev. Ukraine reported that they shot down a lot of them, but several definitely came through. That much is clear. Ukraine is also saying Russia only has enough cruise missiles for 3 to 4 additional strikes. After that, they have to hope to be able to use Iranian ballistic missiles against which Ukraine would have issues intercepting them. We mentioned it a couple of times in the past that Patriot systems, once they reach them, can have a chance of intercepting ballistic missiles with some of their missiles, and the Ukrainians have one type of S-300 system that has limited capabilities against ballistic missiles as well. The rest is more or less useless against them, though. On the Eastern Front, we have reports of Ukrainian attacks in the direction of Sofivka, which is here, so somewhat north of Svatove. Supposedly there have been some gains in the direction of Svatove, but I only have Ukrainian claims for that. I don't have image proof or the Russians confirming it. Also, there are claims that they have advanced somewhat in the direction of Kremlin. Serhiy Haidai, who is the Ukrainian legitimate governor for Luhansk, says that they are advancing in the direction of Kremlin, but the massive amount of landmines that the Russians have placed there are slowing down the Ukrainian side. There have been a number of Russian counterattacks against the Ukrainians here. Several towns were mentioned, but I have not found that a single one of those attacks achieved any gain in ground. Obviously, they are causing casualties on both sides, but I have not confirmation that these Russian attacks have achieved anything. Russian military blogger are writing soldiers in Svatove, or probably around Svatove, are suffering from diseases that are caused by bad hygiene, and they are also suffering medically. They have medical ailments because of wet and cold weather, which would be an indication of either lack of discipline or lack of good equipment when it comes to cold weather. On the Eastern Front, south of the Siversky Donetsk, which is here, we have a massive Russian attacks. Nothing new here. I'm not going to mention every single town where there are just attacks reported without change on the ground. I don't see a point in extending this more than necessary. There are confirmed successes of the Russians west of Berestove, and further south there is another Bilohorivka, one of countless ones in Ukraine, and here they also gained some ground. So the Russians gained some ground here at Berestove. We have an interesting video further south from, wait, I missed it, from Pithorodne. What we can see here is the Ukraine, a car driving along the M103, and this bridge, I've shown it some situation reports in the past, had been destroyed and had been blocking that road that is connecting the front line with which is basically or likely the main line of communication for that front. And at that time, Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians had blown up that bridge. This is a railway bridge over the road that was blocking it. it didn't make too much sense unless it would be an indication of an immediate Ukrainian withdrawal, or it would be another indication of what unfortunately we heard a couple of times before, that the Ukrainians blew up bridges too early over the Siversky Donetsk in the phase where the Russians were gaining some, making some advances, especially north of the Siversky Donetsk. Now here though, in this video at least, this looks like a massive crater, so that might have been strikes with airplanes, as the size of it, at least to my limited knowledge, would not indicate towards artillery. So it might have been, and we are talking about this bridge here. Those are the bridges here. And this is the one that is collapsed. And as you can see, it's leading directly to the front line here at Pithorodne. So for this, in this regard, it's very important, but it was already blown up. So there was some questioning why the Ukrainians would have blown that up. But it seems more likely that the Russians were deliberately trying to cut the railway line north here and maybe in a side effect block the road that is going to the front line. Now we have image proof that this is open. There's another video coming from the east of Bakhmut. You can see artillery fire, and it's interesting in this regard that if we were to watch the whole video, we could see some Ukrainian MRAPs. So it was apparently part of some smaller Ukrainian counteroffensive, but the video is 3 minutes long, so I'm not going to waste all our time. The interesting part, though, is that we directly see where the fighting is, and as you can see, it's directly it's directly the end of Bakhmut. And we see the artillery hits here, which are seemingly or fairly surely part of a Ukrainian counterattack that shows us that the Russians have actually entered Bakhmut, but they have barely entered it. We're talking about a few blocks here inside of a sizable city that is extending fairly much further to the camera position. We also have confirmation that the Russian side have conquered this area here, which supposedly some kind of industrial plant here. And the fighting that we've seen should have been exactly here. So you were able to see that the fighting is, you can clearly see the river here, and the fighting is in front of it. So that fighting has been in this area here, and the Russians are not far into the city as of this. But as said, to come back to it, it is confirmed now that north of that river, the Russians have advanced somewhat in the last couple of days. There have been Ukrainian counterattacks at the south of Bakhmut. There are some exaggerated claims on the internet, on Twitter and on Telegram in the pro-Ukrainian sphere that are claiming that the Ukrainians rolled up the Russians or something like this. I cannot find any confirmation whatsoever. It seems that A, there actually has been a counterattack, and B, it seems that it might have achieved something, but the success is probably limited to a small fraction of Opytne, where I have image proof that the Ukrainians seem to actually have captured something back. So that big counteroffensive probably didn't materialize, at least not as a big counteroffensive, and there is no confirmation of any claimed big successes that were circling around in the past couple of days. Further south, we have attacks around Avdiivka, as usually. Nothing new in this regard here, and we have one thing here in the direction of Nevelske. We now have confirmed Russian gains here, small gains, but gains nonetheless. And there are reports that the Ukrainians do still continue counterattacks in this region, but I don't have any image proof, and I don't have any confirmation of any territory being recaptured by the Ukrainians in this regard. The Russians are saying in Marinka they have now crossed the center of the city, which should probably be this here. This is unconfirmed. They claim if they achieve this, that they can advance further and they can more or less ignore Vuhledar. So in this regard, they say Marinka is extremely important, and there's probably some truth to it, because Kurakhove is a transport hub for the Ukrainians from everything I find. And should they advance in this direction, it might lead to the Ukrainians being forced to evacuate the southern part of the front line here, as the supply situation would diminish massively over the coming days after that, with having lost railway yards and having lost the lines of communication, at least a part of them, into that area. And there are some reported Ukrainian counterattacks in the south here along the front line. I have not found any confirmation of those counterattacks achieving anything. And the Ukrainians report that there was a Russian attack in the direction of Velika Novosilka, so up here. Also no confirmed change in the control of the territory. We have something kind of political about this area, which seems to fit in here, not at the political part in the end, and that is Pushilin, that's the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, said that Wagner and DNR troops are in the process of encircling Bakhmut by advancing north of it and south of it, and basically saying that DNR troops are involved, but many different Russian military bloggers refuted these claims and saying DNR troops are not involved in it at all. That's purely Wagner successors. It's only Wagner mercenaries that are advancing here, and the DNR is basically claiming success in something it's not even involved in. This obviously should not go down well with Wagner and might cause some troubles down the line, down the road, once these claims by the DNR, which are obviously made out of jealousy, out of to hide own failures, if those claims are continuing, it could cause some trouble and some political trouble and infighting between the two factions in the area where they jointly operate or where they are touching each other's areas of operation. Further south, we have reports about Russians further withdrawing from the river, from the Dnipro. Now, I've talked about it in the past that it kind of makes some sense if you want to have a general defensive stance here, to not try to fortify the whole rivers, the whole shore of the river. But now we have reports that supposedly they are withdrawing from Nova Kakhovka and from Kakhovka, so basically from these areas as well. The interesting part, though, is that the Ukrainians report that Russian soldiers tell the Ukrainian civilians there that they are withdrawing and don't completely and basically want to give up all the area to the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainian side, there are voices that this might be a big trap. It seems unlikely that Ukraine is actually running headlong into a trap, not seeing that there are troops left behind to fight them or something. But in general, it could be an option, as the dam allows some troops to cross, but fairly slowly. Should the Ukrainians, I mean, in theory, at least, it is an option that the Russians deliberately withdraw at a juicy point to lure the Ukrainians over, as we can have to see. If they are not shelled while crossing the river, they would probably start doing more than just sending a few special forces. And once Ukrainian troops arrive in force, they are pushed, they are close to the river, with very precarious supply situation that would completely rely upon barges, upon pontoon bridges and ferries, etc. So in this regard, Russian counterattack in this regard could crush those forces on the side, as they have no way to retreat and would be with their back along a river they can't cross without any help, and all that help that is possible could be attacked by the Russian Air Force and artillery. So in theory, that could be the option for a Russian trap. It would probably be a fairly juicy operation. That might actually kind of make sense that the Russians would do this, because to imagine that the Ukrainians have a way to cross the river here without getting under fire and establishing a bridgehead from which they could advance towards the direction of Crimea is a chance that would be very tempting to take and very difficult not to take. Though should the Ukrainians take it, they would be in extremely high risk. That's the current mood on the Ukrainian side, that this is probably a trap. So it seems kind of unlikely that the Ukrainians are taking the bait, but we should clearly state that the bait looks fairly juicy if those reports are true that the Russians are withdrawing there. This is more or less it right now from the front line. We have a lot more about mobilization and political sphering, but there's not much changing at all. I didn't even mention all the artillery shelling, the usage of S-300 and HIMARS by the respective sites. This is obviously continuing. Air operations are somewhat limited in the last few days because of the weather. In the Ukrainian counterattacks around Bakhmut, I have seen videos of Ukrainian combat helicopters, attack helicopters being operated there. So even Ukraine is using its air force, but the overall changes along the front line are close to being negligible. Whether the Ukrainians gain a few meters in the north or whether the Russians gain a few in the south is not going to change the overall dynamics of the war as of now. So not too much to say there. That obviously the fact that the ownership, the control of the ground doesn't change too much, doesn't mean there are no losses. The casualties should be fairly heavy, especially along the front line here, where the Russians do massive attacks into the Ukrainian lines. When it comes to the mobilization, the military commissar for Moscow Oblast has said that the conscripts in February 2023 are going to be called up for 18 months and the ones in fall for full 24 months, so 2 years. This has been refuted now by tons of different sources, including the Ministry of Defense of Russia itself. They said that currently the time for conscription is 12 months and it's so by law, and there is no current initiative to change the conscription duration at all. And if we take the fact, if we look at the Russian laws, the system, there is actually no need to change the conscription whatsoever, because the moment somebody who has done his draft service, who has been drafted, who has done the conscription service, the moment he retires, he's part of the reserves, and as a reserve he can be drafted he can be called up during a mobilization. So that doesn't mean that there might not be some changes in the future, because obviously keeping conscripts for longer would hide the fact that the Russians are building up their forces, and it would avoid calling up reserves in another wave of mobilization. Whereas if they just keep the recruits for longer, that could be probably better be hidden against the public. But as of now, it's neither necessary nor do there seem to be any ways of actually moving forward in this regard. There are some interesting things about desertion. The Ukrainian side published a phone call between a Russian woman and her husband inside of Ukraine who's fighting there. And she said that where she's living, deserted soldiers are being caught, and they are being told that they are being sent to the front line to directly be pushed into the front line to fight, to basically make up for their cowardice. That's my interpretation now. So this is meant to be as a threat. In case you lay down your arms, you're going to be pushed into the absolute front lines, and where the highest risk for your life is. And in Luhansk, here in the occupied Luhansk region, the Russian operated cell phone company is sending text messages to people having the number there that is warning them that desertion is a heavily punished criminal offense. And all of this is when you feel the need to use the cell phone towers to broadcast warnings and intimidation. And the other reports would at least indicate that there is still a massive problem with desertion when it comes to the Russian soldiers. There are other reports, the usual stuff, complaints, videos, etc. This time, for instance, there was a report about a Russian mobilized man running around in the subway in Moscow with his full military gear, including his assault rifle. He supposedly had been injured and put into a hospital without anybody taking away his weapons. So when he left the hospital, he took his assault rifle to stroll through Moscow. Things like this, the whole chaos is continuing. And while we are here, I can mention, because in my German stream, someone asked, what about the spread of weapons from the war in Ukraine? In the past, we mentioned that the violent crime that includes firearms has been basically exploded in Russia. It's massively increased, and up to 6.5 times more in the oblasts directly connecting Russia directly on the border of Ukraine. I've received a message from a viewer in this regard. Obviously, I have a hard time confirming it in detail. He showed a picture proving that he actually was in Ukraine, but according to this, he missed some road and was close to the border and immediately got detained by Ukrainian soldiers. I think it was the border to Slovakia he mentioned. And 3 hours they detained him and searched all his property. And when he left Ukraine over the border to Slovakia, the Ukrainian side searched all his stuff, including explosives detectors, and the Slovakian side did the same again. So, or at least according to him, which unfortunately I can't confirm when it comes to the question and the fear of weapons of war spreading throughout of Europe because of the war, it seems at least that both the Ukrainian side as well as its neighbors do their utmost to prevent this. While it obviously will not be 100% successful, at least the threat is being taken serious in this regard. I have an article here from The Insider. That's an opposition publication in Russia, and it mentions the article. You can pause the video if you want to read it. I'll just scroll it down here so you have the whole length of it. The article explains that Wagner is executing its fighters, some of its fighters, on a regular basis if they desert or if they refuse to fight. And the executions are mostly focusing on prior convicts that have been recruited. And according to this, Wagner is having its own unit just for those executions, and the commander of it has witnessed a couple of those executions, 10 in total, including the one that I recently mentioned of that Wagner mercenary who defected to the Ukrainian side. And there's some rumors here. I cannot confirm it now. This channel here on Twitter is not one of those that usually sends nonsense. So what he generally published is worth at least considering. Unfortunately, I don't see his source here, but he claims that in Donetsk there are now appearing notifications for women to being called up, so that Donetsk is more or less, there are reports for months now that Donetsk is close to running out of men. According to that, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic seems to be starting to call up women to fight against Ukraine. And of course, we need to mention that Donetsk is a part of Ukraine. Thus, the people being called up are Ukrainians that are being called up to fight against their own countrymen in this regard. When it comes to the political sphere, we have a report from the Moscow Times, according to which the Kremlin has asked local leaders and state governments to give them a list of events that are being on schedule, so Putin can visit them, a part of them, to make him appear in a better light. Among those appointments have been the opening of a turkey farm, the annual celebration of the founding of some state companies, or, for instance, the reopening of a damaged road. All of those are now suddenly in his schedule, and the idea behind is that he's showing the public that he's not losing touch, and he's not just a war leader, but also a leader of the civilian government within Russia, and he's still staying on the ground and not just mentioning war topics to distract the public and to kind of keep in touch with them. It's kind of interesting too, because it's reminds us obviously that all these orchestrated events are reminiscent of dictatorships in a well-known way. Putin also met in the headquarters of the armed forces for something that should more or less be called a PR event. He was reported to have worked the whole day in the supreme command in the headquarters of the armed forces, and he was published meeting with Surovikin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. To basically, the idea behind it is then in the other direction, that he's the war leader, that he takes control, and also that a clear sign of trust towards both the supreme commander of the military operation of the war in Ukraine, which is Surovikin, as well as to the head of the general staff, Gerasimov, as well as to Shoigu, who is his Minister of Defense, all of which are to certain degrees under attack by right-wing national ultra-nationalists within Russia, and especially by the military bloggers for their failures in the past. And Putin, for whatever reason, does not want to distance himself as of right now. He rather wants to strengthen their position by appearing publicly with them, showing unity, etc. And we have some more information from the area here. That is a Turkish A400M. It flew to Ukraine on the 23rd of February, so the day before the war began. It is one of two of those A400M, and it was stuck on a Ukrainian airport in Kiev since the beginning of the war. Obviously, the Turkish military unwilling to try to fly out its planes in case they are getting shot down. Now they have been tracked on the trackers. You see them start here, and there are images where they actually were flying out of Ukraine with their active transponders. So Erdogan must have made some kind of deal with Putin to allow the withdrawal of those two planes, which are fairly new transport planes and thus of a high value, that have been sitting in Kiev for the better part of 10 months now, without the Turkish side being able to access those valuable planes. And when it comes to support of either side, we have the GUR, that's the Ukrainian military intelligence, is said that Russia has received new Iranian drones and is currently negotiating about the delivery of Iranian ballistic missiles. The White House has asked Congress to sign off 38 billion of help for Ukraine, but Congress has increased that number by itself to 45 billion US dollars that are earmarked to help Ukraine in its fight. And we have a report about the Slovenian delivered M55S. They are now being part of the 47th Assault Brigade that was just recently established inside of Ukraine as a new formation. The M55S have been given by Slovenia to Ukraine in exchange for German military vehicles as a so-called Ringtausch, under the so-called Ringtausch scheme, whereas Germany gives its Western weapon to nations that run Soviet bloc era weaponry which they hand over to Ukraine. There is obviously discussion whether that's smart or not, as the argument for it being smart is that the Ukrainian have technicians, probably supply trained soldiers on this equipment. The argument against it is that what Germany usually delivers has a much higher combat value than what Ukraine receives. So the argument would be that Germany should better send its modern equipment to Ukraine to fight there. As said, arguments for either side. The M55S in a weird way is not really fitting in this regard, as it's basically a T-55, and Ukraine has not operated those since the end of the Soviet Union. It is heavily modified, so it's not that ancient tank that it's supposed to be. Israeli companies have heavily modified it, including a new gun, 105 millimeter gun, new targeting systems, new ballistic computers. I think it even has thermal vision. It also has new ERA, meant to increase the protection. It has a laser warning receiver, so it's actually a fairly capable tank. It was turned into a fairly capable tank, but the thing is, in regards to the Ringtausch, Ukraine does not operate those tanks and has not operated them in decades. So the availability for spare parts and the availability of trained mechanics and trained soldiers will be somewhat limited, even though the Ukrainians were still working on those tanks in modernization projects, etc. So it's at least not a completely foreign tank to them. That was it already for now. A fairly short situation report in this regard, only 28 minutes, not the usual 40. I still hope you enjoyed it and it was interesting to you. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel, and if you want to support, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much for it. If you like the content, then hitting the thumbs up button is obviously really helpful as well in regards to the algorithm. And if you want to comment, for instance, it would be interesting to know your opinion, whether you think that the Russian offensive towards Bakhmut makes any military sense. Having an argument there, giving your opinion in this regard can be highly interesting and helps with the algorithm. And If you haven't subscribed yet, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and recommend the channel to your friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.